Hi, I'm Jessica Thomas. I'm the executive editor at the American Physical Society. Well, first of all, I should tell you that I'm not actually an active editor right now. I oversee the editorial teams, unlike some of my colleagues who are here at this conference, who are actually handling papers. But back in the day when I did, my first job was actually with the nature journals, and I went into that line of work because I had decided to leave research. I felt that it had gotten too narrow to interest me. And I wanted to use my physics background and kind of my love of science, but to do something that would give me greater exposure to all the science that was out there as opposed to just my narrow little piece of it. I think first and foremost, you have to love science. You have to believe that you are playing an important part in getting the word out about interesting research. And I think if you don't love science, the job won't feel fulfilling, first of all, and it has to feel fulfilling, but also you have to see yourself as part of the science enterprise. Beyond that, you have to feel comfortable making decisions with a limited amount of information, right? You are not consulting every single person that's out there when you're getting information about a paper and whether to publish it. You're consulting, a sampling, and so you'll never have a perfect example of what everyone thinks about a research result. So that's important. You have to believe in integrity. I think that's relevant for this conference, right? You have to believe in the importance of trustworthy science, and that's one of the things I think we lean into the most with the physical review journals. When thinking about what makes a journal great, I think you first of all have to ask, what is the journal trying to do, right? Journals try to do different things. They serve different communities. So first you have to think about what areas of research the journal is trying to serve, and is it trying to be selective, or is it trying to sort of be more archival and put out there the spectrum of research that people are doing in the field without thinking so much whether it's groundbreaking or opening up a big line of research. So that's the first thing. Within that, I think is it consistent, right? If authors submit to different editors, are they getting a consistent experience? Is it fair? Is it objective? Are they able to get the right kinds of expertise to do the peer review? Because at the end of the day, the journal will only be as good as what it's publishing, and the decisions about what you're publishing will only be as good as the referee reports. And so it's really important that the journal be able to get opinions both about sort of the value of the research, how much it's moving research forward, and of course that's particularly important for a selective journal. But then also, you need the reports to be thorough. First, are the claims supported? I mean, that's the fundamental thing that you're asking a peer reviewer. Is it possible to build on the research? Is there enough information there for the next person to sort of build off of it and do what they need to do? Is it clear, right? Can you understand what's there? So those are all the things that go into writing a good peer review report, and I think editors really toe the line on making sure that that is consistent across the board. As we're a society publisher, right? Our journals are supposed to represent the values of the research community. Now, of course, that's across all of physics, but we want our journals to represent where the community is. And clearly, this question about whether research is this question of whether the research that's being put out there is trustworthy is an important question that is really bubbling up a lot in the community. And I want to hear what those questions are. I want to know how we're going to be able to work together with the people in the community, with the funding agencies, to do the right thing, to make the journals as good as they can be, but also to really serve the community with the kind of journals they want to see. So I'm really here to listen and to learn. I think already I can tell just from the for the few hours that I've been here, people are asking the right questions. They're being really productive and insightful about how we're going to figure out what it means to produce reproducible research. I think reproducibility is important for all areas of physics, for all areas of science. I mean, ultimately, what's the purpose of publishing, right? It is from the scientist's perspective, I'm sure there is the piece around, I did this and it's important for my career that I get that out there. We can't ignore that. But in terms of being part of science, it is around putting something out there that other people can build on. So if it isn't reproducible, if it isn't trustworthy, what good is it for the rest of the scientific community? Trying to determine how much research out there is untrustworthy is a really tricky question, and I don't know the answer to that. I think it's something I would even want to ask this group, how are we going to go about answering that question? We do know from surveys, and the APS even ran one with students or researchers. I think they did one with early career researchers around how often have they in their research been a sort of privy to a situation where they felt that there was some level of misconduct in deciding what to put in the paper, or there was some level of cherry picking in the data. The numbers there are quite high. They're not less than 10%. They're certainly more than that. You can see things like 20, 30% of people saying, hey, I've been exposed to some practices in the lab that give me pause about how we decided what data to present. So I think that gives you a sense, but it doesn't necessarily reflect the degree of the problem. So I think when we talk about how we're going to improve the trustworthiness of research, I think we have to recognize we have a complicated ecosystem, right? We've got the researchers, we've got the funding agencies, and we've got the publishers. And these are all sort of intertwined, and no one of them could do it on their own. So I think, first of all, we have to recognize that anything we do has to sort of be mutually agreed with these communities. And I think data availability is one example of that, where all of the different parts are starting to work together and develop somewhat complementary policies, right? So that all published papers can move forward with data availability statements because the funding agencies are pushing for it. So the researchers want to do it, and then the publishers can support it with their policies. So that's a good example. So I think the best thing we could do, and I assume it's one of the things we're going to do at this conference, is think about what are the best practices when you're in the research lab. The moment you decide you're going to do an experiment, does everybody understand what they're trying to do, what they're going to do when they see an interesting effect? How are they going to confirm it? What are the basic checks that you need to do? And that largely starts with the PI, the mentor. How is that person going to convey to their students, okay, you've seen this interesting thing. Now how are you going to check it? If we know that that's part of the culture and we can support that as journals, and the funding agencies are supporting it, then we can start to create policy and structure that helps support those questions. We can invite reviewers to say, do you feel like all of the necessary checks were done here? Do you have faith in the results? If not, what's missing? But I do think it actually starts with the culture in the lab. Well, the pros are that it helps other researchers do what they need to do, because sometimes actually being able to look at the numbers and maybe even compare it to what you're measuring kind of gives you a sense of, if you're trying to replicate an experiment because you want to build off of it, you want to do it yourself, it gives you a sense of whether you're headed in the right direction. I think it also supports trust in science, right? When someone says, well, this is kind of how I did my measurements, this is what I found, it gives you a sense, okay, there was something behind the door, in the same way that if you were buying a cake, you would feel better about eating it because you know all the ingredients that were in it. You would know, for example, whether the factory used peanuts, right? So those statements help give you trust in your product. And so those are the two things that I see as positives. The negatives, it is creating a lot of work, I think, for researchers to put their data together. And we may not have all the structure they need to do that. I know they're already feeling really encumbered. And I do hear scientists talk about the data plans they have to put together for funding agencies. And they'll say, like, this is taking me an enormous amount of time, even when they believe in it, right? Even when they think it's the right thing to do. And I'm just really cognizant that researchers are so overwhelmed with all the things they are doing. So that would be, to me, the thing that is most concerns me the most. I think the other thing is just a question of definition. What do we mean by the data? There's a lot there, I think, to unpack, and right now a lot of it is left to interpretation. And so I think some clarity around terminology and basic expectations, especially when you go from field to field, even within physics, I think there's just going to be different expectations in condensed matter and atomic physics and particle physics and biological physics, just to name a few. Yeah, so there I think journals do play a really important role, and that's largely around policy and expectation for authors. And you're seeing more and more journals have expectation that there at least be a statement of where the data is. And APS, for example, is in the process of preparing those policies as well. And I think in the end, what it does, even if it's a statement of that you're encouraged to share the data and it's not one of enforcement, it makes you think. It reminds everybody who submits a paper, data is important, I should be thinking about this, and it's increasing the expectation in the community that we need to be more transparent, we need to be prepared to stand by the integrity of our data. Ultimately, we like to think people are doing physics for the better of humanity, even if every single result isn't something that a person on the street is going to understand. I don't think that would be a realistic expectation, but ultimately we're after the pursuit of knowledge, right? That's what humankind does. It wants to know the world better. And, as in the United States, for example, like every country, we are funding research. So ultimately, physics is accountable, to the people who are paying for the research. But I also think they are accountable to each other within the community, right? Because this is a group of people that are working on a similar set of problems who've made it their life profession to do physics. And we need to make sure that the people that are within that profession and the future people who come in think it's a trustworthy discipline, that there is a kind of noble goal to it. So I think there is that element as well. I think journals and editors are accountable to some of the same people that I mentioned previously, which are humanity, right? Because we believe that publishing great research is around making research better, and ultimately researchers accountable to all the humans that are out there. We have a responsibility as well to the scientific community that what they read, they can trust, that it's been through rigorous peer review, that the right questions were raised, and whatever went into the decision of deciding to publish it, again, with the limited information that you have, that those decisions were well reasoned, and they were based on the best available information they could have. In a high-impact journal, right? And when we say high impact, what people are really talking about is this result will be exciting to the community. The community will understand why, out of all the research that could have been published, this was one that was picked in this journal that doesn't publish very, very much, right? It's aiming to be very selective. So I think the reasons that the paper was published in a selective journal have to be clear. And usually that means that, or always I think it means for an editor, that it's clear that the paper is interesting. It's clear that it's going to inspire questions, and it's clear that other people are going to want to work on this. It's clear that people are going to be inspired by this result. It's going to make them think. And that, in a way, creates a bias for positive results, right? It creates a bias for something new that was seen. And the word bias, right, is it has a negative connotation. And I think editors definitely feel like they are really trying to serve the community by giving them something that is not only trustworthy, but also interesting. And again, I'm talking really about selective journals here, that it is of high import and worth their time to have paid attention to it. And that definitely means there is going to be a skewing towards positive results, but that doesn't mean that results that show a claim was incorrect or there was a different interpretation aren't also exciting, and there is a place for them as well. Well, ultimately, an editor is responsible for the content in the journal. I mean, that is their job, and we are very transparent about that with the community. That the content of the journal is ultimately the responsibility of the editor. So they have to have the final say over what gets published. Now, within that, though, there's the question of how much should an editor, how much of the editor's view should get balanced with, say, the views of experts, right, who are the referees who are consulted. And there it's a balancing act, right? An editor has to put their view into it because they ultimately have to decide, does this paper, is it interesting enough to publish in this journal? So that's where the weight comes in. But when it comes to whether something is technically sound, an editor will give almost full weight to a referee. So I think when it comes to ensuring the quality of what we publish, I mean, it's really this core thing around the quality of the referee reports, right? And ensuring that the right kinds of expertise was brought in, that the right questions were asked, that when experts don't provide a lot of information, that we push them to provide additional information. And this is something that editors have devoted a lot of time to within the phys rep journals, particularly in the last few years, of really trying to push experts to go beyond sort of a brief or terse report to really elaborate and really substantiate what they're saying. I do think it also matters how we handle problematic cases. When we do find out that a mistake has been made, either intentionally or unintentionally, that we act to address it, right? That's something that we hear from the community, is they are frustrated when things don't happen fast enough or when they just don't get a response. And so I think having the right structure and policy in place, the right people in place, that when we find out something has gone wrong, that we can take the right steps to address it, that we have a strong process that we can stand by and be transparent about. Well, I mean, we have lots of ways to correct a paper, and I think maybe it helps if I explain what those are, because some of them go quite fast, right? If an author determines that they've made a mistake, there's some small mistakes that can be corrected really easily just by modifying the paper. I mean, that's really, really easy. Or they can publish an erratum, and again, that can go quite fast. The more problematic cases are when the authors don't agree with the correction, right? And that's usually where you start to have a slowdown, right? Especially if the reason for a correction or the push to have a correction is coming from someone outside the team, or there isn't agreement within the team. That's where things slow down, because you have more, I would say, boxes to check that you've really understood what's being corrected and that it is the right thing to correct. There's a process. So I think this idea that the paper is the sum total of everything is, people are questioning that, right? This medium has been around for a while, this PDF that we share out there, and that's the whole thing of the research. I'm seeing a lot of people in the community, not just the research community, but people who work in publishing, for example, asking, should we be thinking about the way we report on results differently? And I'm hearing a lot of creative approaches. So some publishers or organizations are thinking about trying to bring attention to the things that happen before the research. And then what you're asking about is the stuff that's happening afterwards, when you find out that, hey, maybe there's more to this paper and I'm going to build on it. And I think there's something really interesting there, right? Like sort of being able to tie together the aftermath to the original paper. Now, I don't know exactly how that's going to look like in the future, but I think the fact that I'm hearing enough people talk about it and it's coming from all the right directions means that this PDF isn't going to be the only way that we report results in the future. I don't know if I would just make a blanket statement that retractions should be made easier. Looking at it from the inside in the cases where we have retractions, I feel pretty good about the process we follow, right? Because we're if it's coming from the authors and they're asking to retract their paper, that usually goes pretty easily, right? It's when there's disagreement, and then we have to stand by the retraction in the same way that we tried to stand by the original result. We have to make sure that the statement, the reasons that something is being retracted make sense and we can stand by them. And we also want to be very careful that we don't damage reputations unnecessarily, right? So I think there's a high bar on our retraction, which is why they don't always go as fast as some would like. The other thing I would say about retractions is we shouldn't stigmatize them, right? If people make mistakes, then there shouldn't be shame associated with correcting the mistake. Instead, it should be seen as sort of being honest and transparent with the scientific community. So anything we can do to remove that stigma for the honest mistakes, we should be doing. When asking about what we should change around physics, I think we're asking largely around sort of the pressure to publish, right? Because that's ultimately what's behind some of these concerns, that people are moving too fast, they're putting like a neat bow on something and not asking all the right questions. And so I do think we have to have a dialogue, again, with the three big components in the room, the publishers, the funders, and the community, about how do we want to do science, right? And then ask whether we need to change all of the reward systems that we have within research to do science in the right way. But until we're all going to sit down and have that conversation, I think we're a little bit stuck on that question. I'm never the kind of person that says physics was better back in the day, or anything was better back in the day. You could say, I suppose, if I look at it, that there was a time when there wasn't very much that was answered. So all the questions were kind of like big questions, and there was maybe more of an opportunity to open our eyes to new things. And now we're perhaps in the point where the field is getting quite mature. So those big questions aren't as obvious. And I think this is potentially quite true for condensed matter, that many people are working on this topic because it's an interesting one, and there are lots of things because materials are so rich and there's so many different ways to put atoms together and so many emergent behaviors that can be seen. There are lots of things you can probe, but sort of the big general questions, maybe there are not as many as those. And so that's kind of created an environment where people are competing for smaller findings. That could be happening. But I can't say that I think physics was better. I think physics still is a beautiful enterprise, right? It's you're asking, how can I see the world differently? Because I know how it works. I'm an eternal optimist that we can fix anything we set our minds to. I think what's needed here is a critical mass of the community coming together and saying, we need to talk about this. And it really does have to ultimately be community-led, right? And I think conferences like this are really important because you have to be noisy if you want to make change and you want to make people think about things differently. So yes, I think if there are problems that we are committed to solving, then we can solve them. I think what I would say is that I really appreciate the organizers of this conference, because they have ensured that all the parties that are coming in here, that it's going to be productive how we talk together. I think there's been a real effort to not launch accusations or no finger pointing, and it really is, hey, we see a problem to solve. Let's put our heads together to solve it. And I think that's the right approach. And I appreciated in some of the talks that I heard at this conference that those who have been on the side of having to point out what they see as a wrongdoing, the lesson that they learned and the approach they took, but also the lesson that they learned was how important it is to always be fact-based, right? To document, have facts, to not, get emotional, not to be accusatory, not to make it personal, but to really make it about the facts. And I really applaud them for focusing on that and saying that, because I think it is the productive way to go forward.